All right, so for our children's lit project, we had farm animals and we were for second grade. And my book is The Big Red Barn. And the summary of the book is it's just all about animals that live in the barn, and it goes through a day in the life of the animals on the farm. So it starts in the morning and then it ends at night and just what the animals are doing and they're sleeping and all of that stuff. And then for the launch part of my lesson, I said that I would start off by playing farm animal sounds, and they would have to guess the animals that are like being played, and then we would read the book, and then I would have them compare, like, oh, did you hear a pig in the video? And then did we read about a pig in the book? So that would get them engaged. And then we would read the book, and then we would talk about the similar animals after, and then the farmer needs our help. So I would tell the students that a farmer needs our help to think about what animals are on his farm, and like how many more animals and less animals, like comparing animals. And then we would do a few practice problems. And then for Explore, they would get into groups of 4, like mixed ability, and solve word problems. And the way to differentiate that would be having them pick their own numbers for the word problems. And then for a summary, we would go over some of the strategies that they used. And then if 2 students solved the same word problem a different way, we could put it on the document camera so that they could see how they solved it a different way. And also, my strategy was to use addition and subtraction within 100 to solve 1- and 2-step word problems.
Okay, so for my book, I had I Wonder Why Farm Animals, and it's a nonfiction book, so there's no like designated plot. It just goes through like the factual information of each animal. So for like lesson purposes, you would only pick 4 animals out of the whole book. And so I chose a graphing standard, and it says draw a picture or a bar graph and to represent the data set up with 4 categories, solve simple put together, take apart, and compare problems using information presented in a bar graph. And so when doing this for the launch part, what you would do, you would read the book, and then you would say like, okay, this corner, this corner, this corner, this corner, each corner is going to represent an animal, and they're going to pick their favorite animal and sort themselves into that. And then they're going to work together to create a people graph, where they would just arrange their bodies in a graph. And then they would each get a picture of their favorite animal for the Explorer, and they would create a picture graph on the whiteboard. And then they would work together in partners to draw like their picture graph that they made. And then they're going to work together in partners still, and they're going to transfer that picture graph into a bar graph. And then as summarized, they're going to share their problems and go through and talk about, like, make comparisons of who favored more animals than one.
For my book, I don't have the actual book because for some reason when I looked it up, it was like $100. So it's a little farm, and this app is called Epic, and it has like hundreds and hundreds of digital books that you can download. So if you want to keep that app in mind, it's free, and you can use it like on iPads and stuff in the classroom.
But for my lesson, my first standard was about determining if a group of objects is an odd or even number. And then my second one was use addition and subtraction to solve word problems that involved length. So we would read the book and then go through, and there's like pages that talk about the cows, and there's so many cows on the page. So we would count them and then like put that number on the board, count how many hens were on a certain page, put that on the board, and do that for a couple of the animals. And then they would have cutouts of like cows, hens, chicks, like all the different animals. And then they would have to use those to try to like pair them up and make pairs within that number, and then decide based on if everyone has a pair or if there was one animal left over, if the number was odd or even. And then you could also have them measure each, like a cow, a chick, a hen, and then they could add like the lengths together, like 1 cow plus a hen is this long, that kind of stuff. And that was fun.
For mine, I had more of a pop-up book, and on each page it's a different animal, and they have little facts about the animals. Like the cows live in a barn, and they give you milk and stuff. And then for my lesson, I have, while I'm reading the book, every time we find a new animal, the students are going to measure from the nose to the tail how long the animal is. And then going into the next part, after we read the book, they're going to find objects around the classroom to measure, and then for the supplementary standard, you have to add and subtract within 20. So they're going to compare two measurements they had, and then tell you like which one's longer and like by how much and stuff.
That's what
Does anybody else need the screen? You do? You need the documents or just keep it on?
Wait, Stephanie, you should stand here. We should be down at one. I'm joining. It doesn't matter. As long as you go first.
Do you guys want me to time it?
Okay, so we were a 5th grade group, and we did ours based on animals, including sea and land. So my book was What's Smaller Than a Pygmy Shrew, and it's just basically a book that talks about things that are pretty much smaller than a pygmy shrew. It starts out talking about a pygmy shrew in relation to an elephant, and then a pygmy shrew is only about 3 inches, so it goes lower than that, and it works with really, really, really small numbers. So I did my focus standard was converting among different sized standard measurement units. So my students would be working with micrometers going to millimeters, centimeters, and stuff like that. So for the launch, we would have the book at the front of the class, and we would read it together and go over stuff because there's a lot of scientific stuff in it, and there's a lot to read. So that would be done as whole class, and then there would be pictures of like pigs and then pygmy pigs, and then there would be pictures of a shrew and then a pygmy shrew, and they would be able to compare and contrast that and then kind of come up with their own definition of pygmy and what it means. And then for the Explore, we would have already talked a little bit about unit conversions. And then, so what we would do with this is we would talk about a pygmy shrew in comparison to an elephant, and then a protozoa or a molecule in comparison to a pygmy shrew. And then I would give them information to figure out how much bacteria would be just on one pygmy shrew. And then in the end, we would come back as a whole class, and students would be able to work in groups. And then this way, we would be able to have a math talk about what each group was able to come up with. If their answers were similar or close enough to each other, and then how they use different strategies.
Okay, my book was kind of related to Stephanie's. They're actually both by Robert E. Wells, but mine went on the bigger side, and it's a blue whale is the biggest thing there is. And so instead of taking a small object and going smaller, it takes a whale, which is the biggest animal on Earth, and then compares it to things that are bigger and asks the question, is a whale really the biggest thing? So it goes from like a whale, and then Mount Everest, and then Earth, and then the sun, and then all the way to the universe. And then it closes by saying, so is a whale the biggest thing there really is? And it's not. So then for the launch, we would begin by having the kids come up with a list of the things that they think are the biggest things in their own life. And then they would pick their top 5, and then each group would research how big one of those objects really are, and then compare it to the size of a whale. And then we would read the book, and then the students would have to figure out how to use their bodies to represent 100 feet, which is kind of how big, on average, a whale is. So they would have to figure out how big their own bodies would have to represent. And then by figuring out how long a whale is, they should hopefully be able to get an understanding of how enormous the universe is. And then we would move to the Explore, which they would have to, do the practice problems, which are all related to the comparisons in the book. And then they could work in partners. And then for the Summarize, we would go over how they solve each of the problems. And the standard is recognizing that in a multi-digit number, a digit in one's place represents 10 times as much as it represents in the place to its right, and a tenth of what it represents in the place to the left. So we would focus on each different place value, and when you look at the tens place, you would figure out how much bigger it is in the ones place or the hundreds place. And that's what we would do.
I did an ebook. It was called, can you see it?
It's upside down.
Oh. There we go. It was called Lobster Secret, and it was written like through the Smithsonian, and it's kind of just will give the students background knowledge on what exactly a lobster is and how it lives and about the creature itself. So we would use weight for this, and during the explore part of the lesson, the launch part of the lesson, we would read the book, and then we would talk about decimals and that kind of stuff. And we would, for the explore, they would have a worksheet that they would work in pairs on, and for the summarize, we would just talk about it as a class and how each person solved the problem, and that there was like different ways that this problem could be solved.
Okay, the book I chose is Where Has Polly Gone by Lisa Service. This is on a Kindle app. I really like this because in my placement they all have iPads, so this is just something nice where they can each pull up the book, and you can even zoom in because in each picture there are several examples of polygons throughout the picture, and they can zoom in and really look at the polygons and kind of do a little bit of an investigation. But this book is about an ostrich named Netta, and she has autism and has trouble focusing in class. It's their last day of school before summer, and they're working on a lesson on polygons. And Netta gets distracted, falls off her chair, breaks her glasses, that goes into tiny, tiny polygons, and then it goes into her search about how she sees polygons and tries to look for Polly, who she believes is this polygon because she wasn't paying attention in her lesson. And so she goes on the search for Polly and finds polygons all throughout the world. And in the end, she runs into her distraction, which is a leopard, and brings her back to class. And this leopard has polygons as their spots all over their body and shows this leopard to the class as her little lesson on polygons. So I really like this book because it has polygons throughout the book. But that leads into our launch portion. So we would first talk about what a polygon is, what they know about polygons, and then read the book to get a little bit of an explore, more in depth about polygons. And then for the explore portion, they would, in their table groups, have pre-cut out polygons, that they would have several tools such as protractors, rulers, many, many more, where they would explore their own polygons and try to classify them and come up with categories, try to organize them in some shape or form. And then at the end, we would come back together, talk about their findings, and see if we as a class could create some type of chart to put them in. This is also a time where students can prove their findings or counter-argue someone else's findings, because they all got to explore different aspects, and they would be able to work with the polygons there more in depth. So, that starts.
So we also did animals, and we did second grade, and my book is The Clock Struck One, and it's just a time-telling tale about a mouse and a cat, and each hour throughout the story something new happens and new animals are introduced, and so on. So for the launch part of my lesson, I would just read the story and then do a smartboard activity learning about analog and digital clocks. And then from then, we would go into the explore part of the lesson, where I would put time note cards around the classroom that are analog clocks. And then they would have this recording timesheet, and they would go around with a partner and fill from the analog and make it digital time, and then give an activity that would be appropriate for that specific time. And the clock also has, if it's AM or PM, so the activity would have to be appropriate for that time as well. So we would talk about the difference between AM and PM. And then after that, we would just have a group discussion on how technology has changed the evolution of clocks.
My book was called Sergio the Penguin. It's actually like a really cute story about a penguin that wants to be a soccer star, but he like fails a lot, and everyone doesn't want him on his team and everything. But like in the end, they have like the biggest like game, and he's able to stop the ball with his feet, so everyone likes him. And it's just like a cute overall story. But I was going to use this story to use estimating measurements and understanding if we should use inches, centimeters, yards, or meters. So when my students would come in the room, I would instruct them to not to count, but just kind of like think about how they get to their seats, and then we would talk about like, so how many steps do you think it took to get to your seats? How would you measure that? Then we would read the book, and the explore part would be I'd have like word problems like Sergio was gonna kick the ball, but he fell and it only moved like 3 rotations. Like what would you use to measure that? Like a yardstick, a meter stick, a ruler. And so there'd be like more in-depth questions as well at the end, like he was able to kick it 3/4 down the field, so they'd have to know how long like an actual soccer field is. But the summative part would be everyone kind of discusses what they learned, and they can have different arguments. Like one student might say, I think we should use a meter stick. Someone would say, you use a yardstick. So we'd have like an overall discussion on it.
So my book was One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. And throughout the book, it just kind of talks about like all different animals. Some are real, some are fictional, and a lot of it has like the different animals. It describes them. So like it talks about how like there's one animal called a whelp and like how many humps it has and so on. And then there's one animal that has like 11 fingers. So it uses numbers a lot throughout the book. And my standard is word problems. So we'd start out and we'd read One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. And then after we read it, the students would all take a sticky note and write their favorite animal on the sticky note that they heard in the book. And then after that, we would use the sticky notes to make a bar graph on the board. And the students would choose like how they think, like what categories they think we should use, like real or fictional animals or so on. And then we'd look at the bar graph as a class. And then as a class, we'd make one word problem as an example based off the bar graph. And then after that, students would get into pairs, and they'd have to create a set of word problems using like any animals or anything inspired by the book. And they'd have to make a set. The standard is using 1 or 2 step word problems to add and subtract within 100. So they'd have to make like 2 or 3 word problems, and in each one they'd have to use like a different method. So they'd have to use addition or subtraction, or have a different part missing, like having the total missing or an addend missing. And then after they create their word problems, they have to write the number sentence that goes along with it with the blank in the appropriate space and like say how they would solve it. And then after the pairs make their word problems, they're going to get together in groups with other groups, and then they're going to look at each other's word problems and try to solve them and create a picture and explain how they would solve them with manipulatives or pictures and so on. And then for the summarize part, after the groups solved like a few word problems, they'd pick 1 or 2 that they wanted to show the class, and they'd show the class the word problem they made and the number sentence they have and how they solved it. And all the groups would go through sharing 1 or 2 of their word problems, and then at the end they would all talk about how they did it, what different ways they solved their word problems, and what different ways they set them up and created them.
Videotape it. I couldn't. I was blanking on the word. What? Is it already on?
Yeah, I think just.
Okay, so we did ours on friendship for 3rd grade, and I did, my book was called Pastry School in Paris, An Adventure in Capacity, and it was about these 2 American children who, they like to cook, and they make this really great recipe, so when they go on vacation with their family to France, they enter themselves in this week-long cooking school.
And while they're there, they have to learn how to convert the measurements from American units to metric units. And in the whole process, they learn all about capacity and all those other kinds of stuff. So for my lesson, I talked mostly about converting units, but then also about capacity. And so to start off, instead of reading the book, I was going to have students like run in place, like, and they take on the role of this marathon runner. And when they get back, they're all hot and sweaty. And I have 2 glasses of water up on the table, which have the same amount of water in it, but are different shapes. And they have to try and guess which one they would choose. They were really thirsty. And so that kind of gets them engaged. And then we move into talking about capacity and volume with the book. And then after that, they go back in for their explore section. They have all these different measurement cups, so metric units like graduated cylinders and stuff, and then also American units like teaspoons and cups. And they have 2 bowls of water, and they have to make their own conversions. So they have to figure out what units are equal and how many of this equal this, and how many pints and this and that. And then for the summarize, we kind of have a group discussion, and we talk about why certain things did or didn't work. And it's really fun.
Okay. I did my lesson on Frog and Toad Are Friends. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this one. It is a 5-chapter book, so I focused on one of the chapters for my lesson because reading all 60 pages would obviously lose the attention of 3rd graders. But for my launch, I focused on the part where the frog and toad go to the pond, and they're swimming with a bunch of different animals, and frog and toad they're obviously their friends. And at the pond, Toad is embarrassed about his swimsuit because he thinks it looks weird on him. The frog is being a very good supportive friend, saying it doesn't look weird on him and he's thinking too much about it and that the swimsuit looks fine. So there's another characteristic of friendship, along with many other examples in the book. But for the launch, we're going to discuss, because prior to this we would be working with Area, and they would create their own pond out of unit blocks, and this is where their answers could always differentiate because they can have any length or any width that they want, and they just have to construct it and give reasons why the area is the area instead of just saying the formula because length times width, because that really does not mean a lot to a 3rd grader. So if they have a better understanding, that will make it more conceptual. And then moving into the explore portion, we go into fractions, and this is where all the other animals that are at the pond with them would be included as well, and they have cutouts given to them of different animals, and they can place however many they want on the pond of each animal. And then we talk about fractions, and we play a guessing game, and kind of guessing what animal we're talking about, being the animal is 1/5 of the total group of animals, or these 2 animals have the same fraction of the group, and this color of the animal is 7/10 of the group, and those would all correlate to different animals from the storybook. And then moving into the explore activity, they will be, after constructing the pond, this is the summary, sorry. So they make equivalent fractions based off of the animal they picked from the hat. So being whatever animal, like say they had the frog and there was 5 out of 10 frogs, they would have to make an equivalent fraction of either anything. It could be 1/2 or it could be 10/20ths, and they would just have to give an example of why these 2 fractions are equivalent, instead of saying you just multiply the top and the bottom by the same number, because again that's just algorithmic. So if you say you multiply by the same numbers because that equals 1, and then when you multiply by 1 the unit stays the same. And then to sum up, students will have different animals, and they would have different fractions, and we go up to the board and summarize all together on how different ways you could solve. And they would also be using models as well.
Alright, so the book that I did was 100 Hungry Ants, and what it's about is basically there's 100 hungry ants, and they're marching to a picnic, and they start out in one line, so it's 1 by 100, and then they're the back ant's wait, we're moving too slow, and so then they form 2 lines of 50, and they march, and then they're wait, we're still moving too slow, and then they move to 4 of 25, and they continue on through all of the factors to get to 100, trying to see the quickest way they can march to get to the picnic. And so for my launch, basically what I would do is we would first sit through and flip through the book so the students could just see the pictures and kind of what's going on. And then we would read the book and go through it. And then I would take my students out into the hallway, and there's 16 of them, and so they would march in 1 by 16, and then they would see, like, oh, wait, like, what did the ants do? And so seeing, like, how fast we get to the other end, and we would, like, time ourselves, like, which way is the fastest. And then from there, we would come back into the classroom, and for my Explore, they would get in, like, groups of 4, and they would have snap cubes, and each group would have 100 snap cubes. And we would start with the first set of ants, and we would go through, and we'd look at the book again and be like, okay, so first they marched what? And so then they would build the snap cubes and see, like, how many is it? And we would have, like, a worksheet where so it's introducing multiplication to them. And so we'd have a worksheet where it's like, okay, so this is 1 by, and then 100. And then we would go through to the second part where it's 2 by 50, and they would have to construct the 2 by 50. And so we just go through like that, breaking it down. It might take more than 1 class period is the only thing that I figured out is, like, it's probably going to take a while for them to grasp it. And then for the summarize, we would come back together and we would discuss, okay, well, like, so what did we learn here? And we would go over, like, okay, well, this is multiplication, and this is how it starts, and it would kind of be like an introductory to multiplication. And they would see that, like, no matter how many ways we arranged it, we still had 100, but it was, like, different ways of doing it with the rows and columns.
So my book is The Rainbow Fish, and I focus on the standards of comparing 2 fractions either with like numerators or like denominators, and measuring the area by counting unit squares. So we'd start by reading the book, and to summarize the book to you guys, it's basically about this little fish who had pretty scales, and all the fish like, oh my gosh, you're so cool, I want to be like you. And then this little fish was like, can I have a scale? And he was like, no, you can't have a scale. And then all the other fish were like, oh my gosh, like, we're not going to be friends with you anymore. And then he was all sad and alone. So then he went to, like, this octopus guy, and he was like, well, you have to share your fish. So then the rainbow fish gave every little fish in the ocean one of his little shiny scales, and he was only left with 1, but it was okay because now he was happy, and he had friends, and, you know, happy little fish. So after we read the book, I'm going to bring out a little, like, replica, like a little cardboard replica of him with all of his shiny fish. And we're going to talk about what the fraction of shiny fish, shiny scales to, like, non-shiny scales would be. So, like, the kids would, like, count together, and then, like, the shiny scales would be the numerator, and then the non-shiny scales would be the denominator. And then I'd bring out, at the end, rainbow fish with only 1 scale. I'll give you guys a visual here. With only 1 shiny scale. And we would compare the 2 fractions of him with the 1 scale to him with the, like, however many scales he had before. And then we would talk about, like, similarities between the 2 fish, like, oh, they're the same size, oh, they have the same number of scales, but this one has this many shiny scales compared to, like, non-shiny scales. And then I'd bring out one of his fish friends in, like, a cardboard cutout. And then we talk about how now the new fish with 1 scale and the rainbow fish with 1 scale have the same amount of colored scales, so they would have the same numerator, but they have different denominators. So I basically asked the kids, like, okay, like, which scale, like, which fraction now do we think is bigger? But we wouldn't talk about it yet. And then they'd go back to their seats, and they would each get a cardboard cutout of a fish, and then a bag of, like, scales, and 1 scale will be shiny, and they'll have a different amount of scales in each bag. So each person will, like, construct their little fish. So, like, at one table there could be a fraction that's, like, 1/4, and then, like, 1/23, and then, like, 1/2, and, like, 1/18. And then as a table, this is the Explore, by the way, as a table they would, like, talk about which fish is bigger, how do they know, can we even compare these fish, which is when they turn over the fish to the back, and on the back would have, like, unit squares, so they'd have to count all those to make sure that, like, these models are the same size so they can compare them. And then we would talk about, like, they as a group would just talk about which one's bigger, like, how do we know that, all this stuff, and then we'd come back all together for the summarize, and each group would have to come up and show 2 of their fish, and they would have to be like, well, we know that 1/2 is bigger than 1/23, and they would show the 2 fish, and they would explain why. And I mean, for, like, the lower level students, they could just be like, because this scale is bigger than this scale, and the higher level students could kind of, like, go a little bit more in depth. And then the rest of the class would be encouraged to ask them questions and kind of, like, well, are you sure that's why? Like, how did you start solving this problem and stuff like that? And then we would have all our class fish, and then that would be that.
I don't think it matters. Okay, so we had relationships, and ours was 3rd grade. And I did the book I Want to Go Home. And it's about a boy named Alex who has to go to his grandparents' house because his mom and dad are in Bora Bora. So he writes letters to his parents saying, like, oh, he's really bored because his grandma treats his sister like a princess, and his brother found a friend to hang out with. But by the end of the book, his letters start to be positive, and he ends up staying an extra week, and then he writes a letter to his grandparents saying that he actually had a really good time. And my standard was graphing and then answering, or making a bar graph and answering how many more and how many less questions. So for the launch part, I would put up a bar graph, and as a class we would fill out the different components you need in order to use a bar graph. And then we would read the book, I Want to Go Home together, or I Want to Go Home, and then we would talk about the different like similarities and differences that they noticed throughout the book. And then for the explore part, they would be by themselves, and they would have a copy of the illustrations and the letters that Alex wrote to his parents, and they would pick out different things that they wanted to graph. So they would use their math journal to like keep track of their data. And then they would get with a partner, and they would compare the different things that they graphed on their bar graph and like share the strategies they used. And they would have to answer how many more and how many less questions depending on the data that they graphed on their bar graph. So then for the summarize section, we'd all come together back as a class, and we'd come up to the projector and show the bar graphs that they used, and then kind of like as an exit ticket, we would fill out another bar graph together, and then by themselves they would answer different questions, and that would let the teacher be able to interpret whether or not the students were able to read the bar graph correctly. In my standard coloring said that.
So my book was called Chester's Way, and it was about his little mouse, and his name's Chester, and it talks about him and his best friend Wilson, and they do everything together in the book. It says how they eat ice cream together, go to school together, go to Halloween together, like everything is about them doing it together, different activities. And then Lily moves in, and it's like a girl in the neighborhood, so they're like, oh, we don't like her, and so they kind of like judge her, and they don't want to hang out with her. But then one day Lily scares away some bullies that were picking on Chester and Wilson. So then Chester and Wilson and Lily all become best friends, and then talks about how all 3 of them get ice cream together, ride their bikes together, and do stuff at different parts of the day. So the standard I did was telling time, and for the launch phase, I would read the book to them first and have them talk about the different activities that went on during the day, because some of them happened in the morning, some of them happened at night. And I would, I would ask students to describe what time of day these are, and then we would kind of transition into clocks, and I would have them describe what's on the clock and what a clock is. And then for the explore phase, I have a little direction sheet, and they would build their own clock. And it's really simple. They just have a paper plate, and they cut out the numbers and do like a push pin to make the hands and all that stuff. And so they would be able to use that throughout the lesson. And then also in the explore phase, I would give them an activity sheet, and it has questions like at 3 p.m., Chester and Wilson played baseball. 22 minutes later, they got ice cream. What time did Chester and Wilson get ice cream? And so there's a number line and a blank clock, so they have to use the number line and the clock to figure out how much time has passed or what the new time is. So during the explore phase, I would have them work on that. And then for the summarize phase, they would all just explain their answers and how they got it. And then I would break the students into small groups, and I would incorporate creative arts into it, because I would have the groups of students act out 2 different things they do, like act out something they do in the morning, something they do at night, and the kids would have to guess. And then they would say what time they do it, like if they brush their teeth at 9 and then go to bed at 8. And the other students would have to figure out the difference between the 2 times. And yeah.
Okay, my book was A Sick Day for Amos McGee, and it won a Caldecott medal, so the pictures are awesome. And it's pretty much just about a zookeeper who visits his friends at work, like a tortoise, a rhino, an elephant, but then one day he gets sick and can't go into work, so then the animals come to his house and take care of him. It's really cute. And my standard was about measuring lengths using rulers marked with halves and fourths of an inch. So for the launch part, I would first read the book and ask students, what do you think you could measure in the book? and then afterwards they would go back to their seats, and I would record what they said on the board, and then I would have a PowerPoint with all of the objects from the book. It's like 20 of them, and I would ask them to estimate how the length of each of them, and then I would record those on the board so that we can go back to it later and compare. And then for the Explorer, they would actually be measuring these objects from the book, and I put these lines on here so they can they know exactly where to start and end their measurement. And they're going to be measuring them vertically and horizontally, and then they'll be recording their answers on a handout so they don't forget later on. And then they're going to talk in their groups just to make sure that they all got the same thing, and they're also going to organize their data in a line plot. And then for the summarize part, we would come together as a group, go over the measurements, make sure everyone got the same thing, and then we would have groups come up to the board, and they would record their line plots and explain how they created them.
Okay, so for my book, I had Perfect Square. I don't have it with me. Okay, so that's the book, Perfect Square. And in the book, it goes from, okay, I gotta show another picture. Okay, it goes from Monday through Sunday, and on the first day, it talks about a red square as a whole. So that's how I would introduce it, and then I can show another picture. There we go. Okay, so then it starts with the red square as a whole, and then it brings into this, on Monday, the square was then cut up into different shapes and circles, and then it was designed into a fountain. And then on Tuesday, the square as a whole was cut up again. So I thought that was really neat. So the direction I took it was, I would give each of the students a square like this, and they would take a ruler, and they would take the ruler and cut up their shape however they wanted to after we read the book. And then I also did it, they could use watercolors, and then they would help them like identify the different shapes. And then they would take the shapes they created and place them on black construction paper. So then the shapes are going to stand out just like how they stand out in the book. And then the students would take their shapes and create a line plot, and that goes along with the standards and about the students being able to recognize shapes with different categories and different attributes. So for our theme was relationships, so in my direction I took it was that the kids would focus on relationships of different shapes and different categories and attributes. So then therefore students would have totally different answers for their line plots and totally different data because they created the shapes they wanted to. So then in the summarize, we would just come back and we would discuss similarities, differences, what shapes they created, how did they create them, and then like their just thought process. So that was my book.
Alright, we did first grade, and our theme was colors. So my book is Color Play, and basically at the back of the book, hold on, gotta get this thing off. There's like all these little pieces that like come out, and you can like put them in the book. Like you pop them in the You pop them in like the top of the book. So like right now it says that the pig needs like more spots. So you would like obviously you wouldn't use this one because this one doesn't have spots on it. But you just pop in the top and it like fills up the color. So then we were going to talk about like adding and how many like colors were added to that page. And I would ask them what does adding mean and what, you know, we just talk about that concept of adding. After that, they'd make their own pieces, like their own colored pieces, and they'd make their own addition equation. And then after that, would just explain all the equations that they made, and they'd show them to the class. That's it.
Okay, so my book is The Day the Cranes Quit, and like the book is about this kid's box of crayons, and they quit because they're mad for like different reasons. And some of the crayons get like used more, and some of them get used less. like the red one gets used a lot, and the pink one doesn't get used at all. And so my standard is using greater than, less than, or equal to. And so throughout the book, I would say, okay, like how big do you think this crayon would be? How big do you think this crayon would be? And then at the end of the book, we're gonna like compare the sizes of the crayons throughout the book, and I would write up on the board like red crayon is greater than pink crayon or whatever crayon I want to use. And then I'd have the kids go back to their seats and like draw them out and like use their own crayons or things around the classroom, and then we would discuss it afterwards.
Okay. My book was called Swatch, The Girl Who Loved Color, and it was basically about this girl who collected colors, and they just loved her, and they were all like excited and everything, and she put them in jars on shelves in her room, and there was yellowest yellow, and that was the only one she didn't have, and she like asked it to get in the jar, and it could live in her room, and he's like, no, that's no way to live, and I don't know, it's just about all the different colors, and like how they wanted to like be happy and like live their own lives, kind of. But mine was shapes, and like distinguishing shapes from their characteristics, and like defining and non-defining characteristics. And the launch section, I just read the book, and we talked about shapes and the sides, vertices, like how you could tell them apart and everything. And after we ended that, we went to the Explorer part, and they take crayons and draw lines all over like a piece of paper and try and like point out the different shapes that they created by doing that, and then filling it in with paint or whatever it was, and then cutting out the shapes after it dried and everything, and creating different like shapes that they might see like in their everyday lives, like taking the triangles and squares and everything, creating animals or something, and putting them together and talking about the different sides and how they all work together and whatnot. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it.